As we've seen, what started the First Crusade was a letter from the Eastern Emperor to the Western Pope asking for Europe's warrior nobles to help him rid Asia Minor of the Seljuk Turks. When some 2,000 peasants showed up, causing mayhem wherever they went, the emperor was furious. When the nobles finally showed up, they stayed only long enough to rest and reprovision, and then they set out immediately for the Middle East. The Eastern Emperor Alexius must have thought, what is going on here? Well, the next 200 years of crusading resulted in the hostile alienation of the Muslims toward Christians. Prior to the invasion of the Seljuk Turks into the Middle East, relations between Muslims and Christians in that area were relatively friendly. The Seljuks changed that into oppression of the regions that they conquered, and especially those that were predominantly Christian. But the Seljuks themselves fell to infighting. Chances are, were it not for the Crusades, other Muslims would have driven the Seljuks back to their homeland, and things would have returned to the way that they were in terms of the relations between Christians and their Muslim neighbors. But the Crusades brought an end to the spirit of cooperation and moderation in Muslim-Christian relations for Christians living under Muslim rule across a wide swath of territory. The only people who welcomed the Crusaders were a handful of minorities who had suffered under Byzantine and Muslim rule, the Armenians and Maronites who lived in Lebanon. Coptic Christians in Egypt saw the Crusades as a calamity. They were now suspected by Muslims of holding Western sympathies while being treated as schismatics by the Western Church. Once the Crusaders took Jerusalem, Copts were banned from even making a pilgrimage there. Well, things soured in the church as well. The already fractured communions of East and West split even further apart when the Roman Church installed Latin patriarchates in historically Eastern centers at Antioch and Jerusalem. And then, during the Fourth Crusade, a Latin patriarch was appointed to the church in Constantinople itself. To give you an idea of what this would have felt like to the Christians of Constantinople, imagine how Southern Baptists would feel if a Mormon bishop was installed as the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Yeah, that ain't going to work. And it didn't work in Constantinople either. Another long-lasting effect of the Crusades was the weakening of the Byzantine Empire, hastening its fall to the Ottoman Turks a couple of centuries later. Arab governments were also destabilized, leaving them susceptible to invasions by Turks and Mongols. A significant new development in monastic history was made at the time of the Crusades in the rise of the monastic knightly orders. The first of these were the Knights Templar, founded in 1118 under Hugh de Payens. Jerusalem's King Baldwin gave the Templars their name, and from them the idea of fighting for the temple passed to other orders. Bernard de Clairvaux, although not the author of the Templar rule, as legend has it, he did write an influential piece called In Praise of the New Militia of Christ, which lauded the new orders of knights. The Templars were imitated by the Hospitallers, who had an even earlier origin as a charitable order. They were organized in 1050 by merchants from Amalfi living in Jerusalem to protect pilgrims. They provided hospitality and care for the sick and helped evolve the word hospitality into hospital. Under Gerard in 1120, the Hospitallers gained papal sanction. Gerard's successor was Ramon de Provence, who organized the Hospitallers as a military order on the pattern of the Knights Templar. The Hospitallers, also known as the Knights of St. John, eventually moved to the island of Rhodes and then Malta, where they held out in 1565 in a protracted siege against the Turks in one of history's most significant battles. Another important military order, the Teutonic Knights, arose in 1199 during the Third Crusade. The knightly monastic orders had certain features in common. They viewed warfare as a devotional way of life. The old monastic idea of fighting demons, as seen in the ancient Egyptian desert hermits, evolved into actual combat with people cast as agents of evil. Spiritual warfare became actual battle. Knights and their attendants took vows similar to other monks. They professed poverty, chastity, and obedience, along with a pledge to defend others by force of arms. While personal poverty was vowed, using violence to secure wealth was deemed proper so that it could be used to benefit others, including the order itself. So much so, in fact, that the Templars became an object of envy for the immense wealth that they accumulated. That wealth would end up being the main cause of their eventual demise, as we will see in a later episode. And get ready, because that is a fascinating chapter of church history. In reviewing the relations between Christianity and Islam during the Middle Ages, we should remember that there were many peaceful interchanges. Some Christians advocated peaceful missions to the Muslims. These encounters can be seen in the exchange of art. Christians valued Muslim metalwork and textiles. Church vestments were often made by Muslim weavers who snuck hidden messages into their work. Such a vestment is located today at Canterbury. It contains Arabic script that says, "Great is Allah and Muhammad is his prophet." Now, on the positive side, if there was anything positive to be gleaned from the crusade, it did promote a greater sense of unity in Western Europe. Remember that one of the reasons Pope Urban promoted the First Crusade was to divert the violent habits of the European nobles who were constantly at each other's throats. Instead of warring with one another back and forth across Europe, watering its fields with blood, they united to go against infidels way over there. Well, the Crusades also led to increased prestige for the papacy as they were able to mobilize huge numbers of people in a common cause. The Crusades stimulated an intellectual revival in Europe as crusaders returned with new experiences and knowledge from another part of the world. After the First Crusade, over the next 60 years, Jerusalem saw a succession of weak rulers, while Muslims from Damascus to Egypt united under a new dynasty of competent and charismatic leaders. The last of these was Saladin, or more properly, Saladin, founder of the Ayyubid dynasty of Islam. He became caliph in 1174 and set out to retake Jerusalem. Now, the king of Jerusalem at the time was Guy. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his full name. King Guy led the Crusaders out to meet Saladin's forces at a hill on the west side of the Sea of Galilee called the Horns of Hattin. Both the Templars and the Hospitallers were there in force, and the much vaunted True Cross was carried by the Bishop of Acre, who himself was clad in armor. On July 5th of 1187, the decisive battle was fought. The Crusaders were completely routed. 30,000 of them perished. King Guy, the leaders of the Templars and the Hospitallers, along with a few other nobles, were taken prisoner. Saladin gave them clemency. The fate of the Holy Land was now decided. On October 2nd of 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem after it made a brave resistance. The generous conditions of surrender were mostly creditable to the chivalry of the Muslim commander. There were no scenes of savage butchery as had followed the entrance of the Crusaders 90 years before. The people of Jerusalem were given their liberty if they paid a ransom. Europeans and anyone else who wanted to were allowed to leave. For 40 days, the procession of departing continued. Relics stored in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were redeemed for the sum of 50,000 byzants, named after the Byzantine coin where they were the medium of exchange. The byzant was a gold coin of about 5 grams. Thus ended the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Since then, the worship of Islam has continued on Mount Moriah without interruption. The other European conquests of the First Crusade were then in danger from the unending feuds of the Crusaders themselves, and in spite of the constant flow of recruits and treasure from Europe, they fell easily before Saladin. He allowed a merely ceremonial Latin ruler to hold the title of King of Jerusalem, but the last real king was Guy, who was released and then traveled around claiming the title of king but without a court or a capital. He eventually settled on the island of Cyprus. We're going to go into less detail for the rest of the Crusades as we finish them off over this and the next episode. The Second Crusade was sparked by, 2 events: the fall of the Crusader state of Edessa in Syria and the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux. Note that the Second Crusade took place before the arrival of Saladin on the scene. Edessa fell to the Turks in December of 1144. The Turks built a fire in a large breach that they had made in the city wall. The fire was so hot that it cracked a section of the wall 100 yards long. When the wall then collapsed, the Turks rushed in and unleashed the same kind of brutality that the Crusaders had when they conquered Jerusalem. Pope Eugenius III saw the Turk victory at Edessa as a threat to the continuance of the Crusaders in Palestine, and he called on the King of France to march to their relief. The forgiveness of all sins and immediate entrance into heaven were promised to all who embarked on a new crusade. Eugenius summoned Bernard of Clairvaux to leave his abbey and preach the crusade. Now, Bernard was the most famous person of his time, and this call by the Pope came at the zenith of his fame. He regarded the Pope's summons as a call from God. On Easter of 1146, King Louis of France vowed to lead the crusade. The Pope's promise of the remission of sins was dear to him, as he was stricken with guilt for having burned a church with 1,300 people inside. How grand to be able to gain forgiveness by killing more people! He assembled a council at Vézelay, at which Bernard made such an overpowering impression by his message that all present pressed forward to take up the Crusader cause. Bernard was obliged to cut his own robe into small fragments and give them away to anyone who wanted something that they could carry then to the east on the Holy Crusade. He wrote to Pope Eugenius that the enthusiasm was so great, quote, "Castles and towns were emptied of their inmates. One man could hardly be found for 7 women, and the women were being everywhere widowed while their husbands were still alive," unquote. Meaning that most of the men set off on the crusade, leaving the population of France with 7 women to every man. But hey, lucky them. From France, Bernard went to Basel in modern-day Switzerland, then up through the cities along the Rhine as far as Cologne. As in the First Crusade, persecution broke out against the Jews in that area when a monk named Radolf questioned why they needed to go to the Middle East to get rid of the God-haters and the Christ-killers. Well, there are plenty of them right there in Europe. Now, Bernard objected vehemently to that. He called for the church to attempt to win the Jews by discussion and respect, not by killing them. Bernard, as I mentioned, was the celebrity of the day, and thousands flocked to hear him. Several notable miracles and healings were attributed to him. The German Emperor Conrad III was deeply moved by Bernard's preaching and was convinced to throw his weight behind the crusade. Conrad then raised an army of 70,000, a tenth of whom were knights. They assembled at Regensburg and proceeded through Hungary and on to the Bosporus. All along the route, they were, well, less than welcome. Conrad and the Eastern Emperor Manuel were brothers-in-law, but that didn't keep Manuel from doing his best to wipe out the German force. The guides that he provided led the Germans into ambushes and traps, then abandoned them in the mountains. When they finally arrived at Nicaea, famine, fever, and attacks had reduced the force to a tenth of its original size. Now, King Louis sent out in the spring of 1147 and followed the same route that Conrad had taken. His queen, Eleanor, who was famed for her beauty and skill as a leader, along with many other ladies of the French court, accompanied the army. The French met up with what was left of Conrad's force at Nicaea. The forces then split into 2 different groups, which all reached the port of Acre in 1148. They met King Baldwin III of Jerusalem and pledged to unite their forces in an attempt to conquer Damascus before retaking Edessa. The siege of Damascus was a complete failure. The European nobles fell to such infighting that their camps fragmented into warring groups. Conrad left for Germany in the fall of 1148, and Louis returned to France a few months later. Bernard was humiliated by the failure of the crusade. He assigned it to the judgment of God for the sins of the Crusaders and the wider Christian world. A little more now about King Louis's wife, Eleanor. Eleanor of Aquitaine was really something. In a world dominated by men, Eleanor's career was something special. She was one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Europe during the entire Middle Ages. At the tender age of just 15, Eleanor succeeded her father as the ruler of Aquitaine and Poitiers in what is now southwest France. She was then the most eligible bride in Europe. 3 months after her ascension, she married King Louis VII, and as Queen of France, she went on the Second Crusade. And then, with its defeat back in France, she got an annulment from Louis on the basis that they were relatives. She then married Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy, and the Count of Anjou. Henry soon became King Henry II of England in 1154. This, despite the fact that Henry was an even closer relative than Louis had been and 9 years younger than Eleanor. They were married just 8 weeks after her annulment. But over the next 13 years, Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 2 daughters, 3 of the sons would eventually become kings. Henry and Eleanor eventually became estranged. She was imprisoned for 16 years for supporting her son's revolt against her husband. When Henry died in July of 1189, Eleanor was released from prison. Her son, Richard, then became the king. We know him as Richard the Lionheart. His first act as king was to order the release of his mother. Now, as the Queen Dowager, Eleanor acted as regent while Richard went on the Third Crusade. She survived Richard and lived well into the reign of her youngest son, John, known as the worst king in England's long history. It's that King John who's cast as the villain in the story of Robin Hood. The Third Crusade is referred to as the King's Crusade due to the European monarchs who participated in it. It was an attempt to recover the Holy Land from the Muslims who, under Saladin, had reclaimed the lands that the Crusaders took in the First Crusade. The Third was, for the most part, successful, but fell short of its ultimate goal, which, of course, was the reconquest of Jerusalem. When Saladin captured Jerusalem in 1187, the news rocked Europe. The story goes that when word of the loss of Jerusalem reached Pope Urban III, he was so traumatized he died of shock. Well, Henry II of England and Philip II of France ended their dispute with each other to lead a new crusade. When Henry died 2 years later, Richard then stepped in to lead the English. The elderly Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa also responded to the call to arms and led a massive army across Turkey. Sadly, Barbarossa drowned while crossing a river in June of 1190, before reaching the Holy Land. His death caused great grief among the German crusaders. Most were so discouraged that they turned around and went home. But after driving the Muslims from the port at Acre, Frederick's successor, Leopold V from Austria, and King Philip left the Holy Land in August of 1191, leaving Richard to carry on the crusade by himself. Saladin failed to defeat Richard in any of their military engagements, and Richard secured several key coastal cities. But the English king realized a conquest of Jerusalem was not now possible because of his diminished force in the September of 1192. And so he made a treaty with Saladin by which Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims and merchants to visit the city. Richard then departed the Holy Land a month later. The successes of the Third Crusade allowed the Crusaders to maintain a considerable kingdom based on the island of Cyprus and along the Syrian coast. Its failure to recapture Jerusalem led to the call for the Fourth Crusade 6 years later. The Third Crusade was yet another evidence of the Europeans' inability to form an effective union against the Muslims. The leaders and nobility of Europe made great promises of unity when they first set out on a crusade, but the rigors of the journey, along with the imminent prospect of victory, saw them more often than not falling out with each other in their incessant and petty squabbles. On Richard's journey back to England, he was seized by the aforementioned Leopold V, the Duke of Austria, whose enmity he'd incurred in the Battle of the city of Joppa. The Duke turned his captive over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who also had a grudge to settle. The Lionheart was released on the humiliating terms of paying an enormous ransom and consenting to hold his kingdom as a mere fiefdom of the empire. It's this hostage-taking of Richard the Lionheart that forms the backdrop for the tale of Robin Hood. Saladin died in March of 1193, by far the most famous of the Crusader foes. Christendom has joined with Arab writers in praise of his courage, culture, and the magnanimous manner in which he treated his enemies. Historians debate how many crusades there were. It wasn't as though, King Henry and Philip said, "Hey, let's make nice and launch the Third Crusade." They didn't number them as historians have since. But history tends to ascribe 9 as the number of crusades, then adds a couple more by assigning them with names instead of numbers. And so you have the Albigensian and the Children's Crusade, which took place between the Fourth and the Fifth Crusades. But generally, the Fifth through Ninth Crusades are considered lesser armed movements, while the first 4 are called the Great Crusades. We're going to end this episode with just a brief review of the Fourth Crusade. Innocent III became pope in 1198, and he called for the Fourth Crusade, which served as the final blow that forever sundered the Western and Eastern churches, though that was certainly not his aim. In fact, he warned the Crusaders against the actions they ended up taking that drove the wedge that divided East and West. Pope Innocent's plan was simply to destroy a Muslim military base in Egypt. The merchants of Venice had promised to supply the Crusaders with ships at a huge discount, one that the Crusaders couldn't pass up. So in the summer of 1202, they arrived in Venice expecting to sail to Egypt. There was a problem. Only a third of the expected number of warriors showed up, and they came up with a little more than half the required fee. Well, a prince from the east stepped in, offered to finance the balance under one condition, that the Crusaders sail first to Constantinople, dethrone the current Eastern emperor, and hand it over to him. They could then sail on their merry way to Egypt. Pope Innocent forbade this diversion. No one paid him any mind, no attention. On July 5th of 1203, the Crusaders arrived in Constantinople. The people there were by now fed up with these Europeans meddling in their affairs and formed a counter-revolution that swept the current emperor off the throne so they could install their own fiercely anti-Crusader ruler. Being now shut out of his hopes, the would-be emperor who had paid the Crusaders' way to Constantinople refused to pay their way to Egypt, leaving them stranded in increasingly hostile territory. Well, the Crusaders were furious. Their leaders decided to make the best of it and called for a quick plundering of Constantinople. One of the Crusader chaplains proclaimed, in complete disregard for the Pope's wishes, quote, "If you rightly intend to conquer this land and bring it under Roman obedience, all who die will partake of the Pope's indulgence," unquote. Well, that was like letting a wild dog off of its chain. For many Crusaders, that was not only an excuse to get rich by taking loot, it meant a license to do whatever they pleased in Constantinople. On Good Friday of 1204, the Crusaders, with red crosses on their tunics, sacked Constantinople for 3 days. They raped and killed fellow Christians. The city statues were hacked to pieces and melted down. The Hagia Sophia was stripped of its gold. A harlot performed sensual dances on the Lord's table, singing vile drinking songs. One Eastern writer lamented, quote, "Muslims are merciful compared with these men who bear Christ's cross on their shoulders," unquote. Neither the Eastern Empire nor Church ever recovered from those 3 days. For the next 60 years, Crusaders from the Roman Church ruled what was once Eastern Europe. The Eastern Emperor established a court in exile at Nicaea. Rather than embrace Roman customs, many Eastern Christians fled there. And there they remained until 1261, when a new Eastern ruler retook Constantinople and ended the Crusaders' presence.